A 911 dispatcher takes a call that violates the most basic laws of nature. A mother reports finding her 8-year-old son and 4-year-old daughter hanging from a single wire dog lead in her basement. The operator desperately instructs her to cut them down, every passing second eroding their vanishing chance of survival. The mother flatly refuses. She claims she is too anxious. She tells dispatch she might somehow injure herself. 2 children are suffocating, and their sole protector just stands there, watching. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. Albany Township, located in the northern reaches of Berks County, Pennsylvania, is defined by its vast stretches of working farmland, rolling hills, and winding 2-lane asphalt roads. Positioned roughly halfway between Allentown and Reading, the township is sparsely populated. Houses here do not sit shoulder to shoulder in neat subdivisions. Instead, they occupy multi-acre plots, separated by deep tracts of timber and sprawling cornfields. This geographical layout inherently breeds privacy. Residents mind their own business, waving from the cabs of passing trucks, but rarely scrutinizing what happens behind their neighbors' closed doors. It is an environment where isolation is the default, a geographic feature that perfectly insulates domestic dysfunction from outside intervention. The residents on Route 143 fit seamlessly into this rural tapestry. It was a modest, aging structure showing obvious signs of deferred maintenance. The exterior was weathered, the yard perpetually unkempt. Inside, the reality of the occupants' lives was immediately apparent. The living spaces were overwhelmingly cluttered, a physical manifestation of a chaotic household. The main floor was cramped with overflowing boxes and the general detritus of a family barely scraping by. Below the main living area sat an unfinished basement, a dank, dimly lit concrete bunker used strictly for storage. It smelled of damp earth and stagnant air. It was decidedly not a place for children to play. 36-year-old Lisa Snyder commanded this environment. To the casual observer and her digital audience, she aggressively projected the persona of an exhausted but deeply devoted single mother. Raising 3 children on a limited income in a remote location is an objective hardship, and she weaponized this reality to cultivate sympathy. Her social media presence was a steady stream of updates highlighting her daily struggles, financial woes, and her supposedly fierce protective instinct over her kids. She demanded validation and pity, constructing a brittle psychological facade that masked a profound, chilling apathy. The primary subjects of her online narrative were her 2 youngest children, 8-year-old Connor and 4-year-old Brinley. Brinley was an affectionate, dependent toddler who closely shadowed her older brother. Connor was a gentle 3rd grader whose life was heavily dictated by severe physical and developmental challenges. He carried extra weight and suffered from significant motor skill deficits. His physical coordination was demonstrably poor. His manual dexterity was so underdeveloped that he required constant assistance with fundamental childhood tasks. He could barely manage the intricate finger movements necessary to tie his own shoelaces. This documented, undeniable lack of physical capability was a tragic reality of his daily routine, and it would soon become the central, damning piece of evidence to shatter his mother's fabricated alibi. Sharing the cramped space was Lisa's 17-year-old son. He functioned as a ghost within his own home. Like many teenagers trapped in a toxic environment, he engaged in self-preservation through total withdrawal. He spent the vast majority of his time retreated behind his bedroom door, isolating himself from the erratic emotional temperature of his mother and the constant demands of his younger siblings. He was physically present but emotionally detached, an involuntary observer to a domestic situation quietly accelerating toward a violent breaking point. The friction between the expansive, open landscape of Berks County and the suffocating reality inside the house on Route 143 was absolute. Behind the peeling paint and cluttered windows, financial desperation and emotional neglect festered under the absolute control of a woman whose maternal instincts had completely inverted. The community saw a beleaguered mother fighting to keep her family afloat, utterly unaware that the greatest threat to Connor and Brinley was the very person responsible for keeping them alive. The interior life of the Snyder household was a paradox of extreme isolation and carefully curated digital overexposure. Lisa Snyder operated within a self-constructed echo chamber to the outside world, accessed entirely through the glow of her smartphone. She was a martyr. She meticulously crafted a narrative of victimhood, presenting herself to online acquaintances as a woman crushed by the insurmountable pressures of poverty, single motherhood, and the relentless demands of a child with special needs. This digital avatar garnered sympathy, validation, and a twisted form of social currency. Yet, when the screen went dark, the performance abruptly ended. Behind the heavy wooden doors of her Route 143 home, the maternal warmth vanished. It was replaced by a chilling, pervasive apathy. The children were not subjects of affection. They were viewed as liabilities, living, breathing obstacles interfering with her autonomy. This severe disconnect between public projection and private reality was not a sudden development. The structural decay of the family possessed a documented institutional history. In the fall of 2014, Berks County Children and Youth Services executed an intervention that should have served as a permanent severing of her parental rights. Caseworkers responding to a local tip did not find a home merely struggling with economic hardship. They uncovered an environment of profound, dangerous neglect. The floors were coated in filth, the air was thick with the stench of animal waste, and basic medical and hygienic care was non-existent. Connor, then a vulnerable toddler, alongside his older brother, was immediately removed from her custody. The state recognized the imminent threat and placed the boys in protective foster care. For a brief window of time, the system functioned as designed. The children experienced a stable, sanitized environment. However, the bureaucratic machinery of family court often prioritizes biological reunification over objective, long-term safety. After completing a mandated series of parenting classes and demonstrating a superficial, temporary improvement in her living conditions, Lisa regained full custody in early 2015. Brinley was born shortly thereafter. The return was a death sentence delayed. The initial compliance forced by the courts quickly eroded. Without the constant, looming gaze of caseworkers, the household rapidly regressed into its former state of squalor and emotional starvation. The 2014 intervention did not rehabilitate her maternal instincts. It merely taught her how to better hide her dysfunction from institutional oversight. Connor bore the heaviest physical and psychological weight of this toxic regression. His challenges extended far beyond the typical academic struggles of a third grader. He required a strict individualized education program to navigate a basic curriculum. His developmental delays were stark and undeniable. He walked with a heavy, uncoordinated gait. Tasks requiring fine motor skills presented insurmountable barriers. He could not manipulate the metal clasps on his own winter coat or exert the hand strength required to twist open a sealed plastic bottle. He was a boy who required profound patient support, the exact antithesis of what his mother was willing to provide. Instead of fostering his development, she exploited his vulnerabilities. Months before the fatal incident, she began laying the groundwork for a sinister, fabricated narrative. She actively planted seeds with school administrators and extended family members, claiming that her son was the victim of relentless, severe bullying. She painted a grim picture of an 8-year-old so tormented by his peers that his mental health was fracturing. She told counselors that Connor hated school, that he was deeply depressed, and that he harbored dark, self-destructive ideations. This was a calculated, proactive projection. The district found zero evidence to corroborate her aggressive claims. Teachers, aides, and bus drivers reported a boy who, while facing immense physical hurdles, was generally cheerful, resilient, and well-liked by his classmates. The darkness she described did not originate from the elementary school playground. It emanated entirely from her own mind. While Connor was the focal point of her psychological manipulation, 4-year-old Brinley was simply caught in the gravitational pull of her mother's resentment. The toddler was affectionate, entirely dependent, and blissfully unaware of the tension saturating the house. She shadowed her older brother everywhere he went, a fierce sibling loyalty that would ultimately ensure they shared the exact same fate. By the late summer of 2019, the economic and social claustrophobia of her existence reached a critical mass. The financial strain was absolute. Her oldest son, navigating his own teenage turmoil behind a locked bedroom door, offered no emotional harbor. She was trapped in a rural prison of her own making, surrounded by acres of empty Pennsylvania farmland that only amplified her isolation. The transition from chronic neglect to active malice was a quiet internal shift. She did not exhibit the erratic, explosive behavior typical of a sudden psychological break. Instead, her actions grew methodical. The apathy hardened into a cold, transactional logic. She began viewing her dependents not as human beings requiring care, but as localized problems requiring a permanent solution. It was the culmination of years of institutional failure, profound selfishness, and a total catastrophic collapse of human empathy. September 23, 2019. The weather across eastern Pennsylvania was unseasonably warm, a mild and quiet early autumn afternoon. At Greenwich-Lenhartsville Elementary School, the final bell signaled the end of the academic day. Connor navigated the crowded hallways and boarded his usual yellow school bus for the long ride back to the rural stretches of Route 143. Security cameras mounted above the driver's seat captured his exact demeanor during the transit. He was not crying. He was not withdrawn, trembling, or exhibiting any signs of trauma. The grainy color footage showed an 8-year-old boy smiling, interacting casually with his peers across the aisle, and staring out the window at the passing acres of harvested cornfields. He exhibited absolutely zero evidence of the profound psychological distress and active suicidal ideation his mother had so loudly broadcasted to the district administration. He was simply a child heading home for the afternoon. The heavy vehicle ground to a halt at the edge of his gravel driveway shortly after 2:40 p.m. The hydraulic doors hissed open. Connor stepped down onto the shoulder of the road, visibly struggling to adjust the straps of his heavy backpack due to his documented lack of fine motor skills. He turned, walked up the long driveway toward the weathered exterior of his house, and disappeared inside. It was the last time the outside world would see him conscious. What unfolded inside the residence between the moment the front door clicked shut at 2:40 p.m. and the initial emergency dispatch at 4:33 p.m. remains a timeline entirely controlled by the perpetrator. The physical layout of the home is critical to understanding the mechanics of the horror that followed. The 17-year-old son was upstairs, secured behind his closed bedroom door with his headphones firmly over his ears, effectively isolated from the auditory landscape of the rest of the house. Lisa was downstairs with Connor and 4-year-old Brinley. The main floor of the cluttered home gave way to an unfinished basement, a subterranean space accessible only by a narrow, steep flight of hollow wooden stairs. Sometime during this unaccounted 90-minute window, a complex lethal mechanism was constructed in the damp, windowless gloom below the floorboards. The main support beam of the basement ceiling ran horizontally across the center of the room, exposed and splintered. Over this thick timber, a single, black, heavy-duty wire dog lead was draped. The lead was exactly 3 feet long, coated in thick, weather-resistant plastic, and equipped with stiff, spring-loaded metal swivel clasps at both ends. Directly beneath the wooden beam, 2 heavy, high-backed dining room chairs were positioned side by side. The physical reality of this staging was fundamentally at odds with Connor's physical capabilities. The support beam was well over 7 feet off the ground, far out of his vertical reach. The wire dog lead required significant finger dexterity and grip strength to manipulate, loop over the timber, and secure tightly. The dining room chairs were bulky, weighted items that would need to be dragged from the upper floor kitchen, navigated around tight corners, and wrestled down a steep, treacherous flight of stairs. An 8-year-old boy who lacked the manual coordination to fasten his own winter coat, who could not exert the pressure required to pop the tab on a soda can or successfully tie his own shoelaces, could not have engineered this complex setup. He could not have carried those chairs down the steps. He definitively could not have hoisted his 40-pound sister into the air, secured a stiff metal clasp tightly around her throat, and then managed to do the exact same thing to his own neck, while maintaining the precise tension required for the single wire lid to function as a simultaneous double noose. It was an absolute mechanical and physiological impossibility. Yet the heavy chairs were eventually kicked over. The wire was pulled brutally taut. Two small children were suspended in the dim, stale air of the basement, slowly asphyxiating in the silent house, while their mother remained entirely conscious and physically capable on the floor directly above them. At exactly 4:33 p.m., the heavy silence of the property was broken by an incoming call to the Berks County 911 dispatch center. Lisa's voice came through the line, eerily steady. She reported that she had just gone down to the basement to check on the kids, supposedly after noticing the house was too quiet, and found them hanging from the ceiling. The dispatcher, immediately recognizing the catastrophic, time-sensitive nature of the emergency, shifted into a mode of rapid, controlled urgency. He ordered her to physically lift the children to relieve the extreme pressure on their windpipes. He instructed her to grab a kitchen knife, a pair of heavy scissors, wire cutters, or anything sharp, and sever the lead immediately. Her response defied every known biological imperative and maternal instinct. She flatly refused to intervene. She claimed she was sweating too much. She told the operator her anxiety was suddenly spiking to debilitating levels. She argued that the dog lead was wrapped too tightly, and if she tried to lift their dead weight or cut the thick plastic-coated wire, she might accidentally injure them further or hurt herself in the process. The dispatcher's voice grew significantly louder, shedding protocol for raw human desperation, begging the mother to find a way, any way, to restore airflow to her children. She remained coldly anchored in her hollow excuses. She stayed on the line, actively narrating her own alleged panic, while the clock ticked mercilessly forward. Irreversible brain death from oxygen deprivation begins within 4 to 6 minutes. Every single second she spent arguing with dispatch was a second Connor and Brinley were actively dying. She did not scream for her strong teenage son upstairs to rush down and help lift the weight. She did not sprint to the kitchen for a carving knife. She simply stood back and waited for the inevitable. The emergency dispatch tones dropped across the northern sectors of Berks County. Heavy sirens shattered the quiet autumn afternoon. Pennsylvania state troopers and local volunteer paramedics pushed their fleet vehicles to the absolute mechanical limit, their tires violently gripping the winding two-lane asphalt of Route 143. The first units breached the perimeter of the property within 8 minutes of the initial 911 call, an incredibly fast, aggressive response time for the sprawling rural jurisdiction. The scene they encountered upon kicking open the front door was a study in horrific, surreal contrasts. The mother was pacing, presenting as agitated but entirely unharmed, gesturing toward the basement door. The older brother finally emerged from his upstairs bedroom, completely bewildered by the sudden, violent invasion of uniformed personnel, having been completely oblivious to the nightmare that had unfolded directly beneath his feet. First responders hit the basement stairs at a sprint. The air below grade was heavy, smelling of ancient dust and raw earth. Tactical flashlights swept the shadows, instantly locking onto the main beam. The paramedics and troopers did not hesitate. They did not experience the paralyzing anxiety the mother claimed had incapacitated her. A state trooper produced a heavy-duty tactical folding blade, stepped quickly onto the overturned wooden dining chairs, and forcefully sawed through the thick plastic-coated wire. The tension snapped. The children's limp bodies collapsed downward into the waiting, outstretched arms of the medics. Their physical condition was devastating. They were profoundly cyanotic. Their skin tinged a terrifying ashen blue from prolonged, catastrophic oxygen starvation. They were completely unresponsive to pain stimuli. Their pupils were fixed and dilated. There was zero spontaneous respiration. No palpable pulses could be found at the carotid or radial arteries. The cold concrete floor of the cluttered basement instantly transformed into an active, desperate trauma bay. Paramedics initiated aggressive, two-person cardiopulmonary resuscitation on both children simultaneously. The rhythmic, mechanical crunch of deep chest compressions echoed off the cinder block walls, a desperate cadence against the silence. Intravenous lines were rapidly drilled directly into the intraosseous tissue of their tiny, collapsing veins to push massive doses of epinephrine. The medics worked with a furious, highly controlled panic, refusing to accept the grim physiological reality of the timeline they had been handed. Outside the house, the deep, thumping hum of heavy rotors announced the arrival of two separate med-evac helicopters. touching down in a nearby clearing to avoid the power lines on Route 143. Inside, the frantic, exhausting efforts yielded a microscopic, fragile sliver of hope. Faint, thread-ready pulses were miraculously restored in both Connor and Brinley. They were not breathing on their own, and their neurological status remained a dark abyss, but their hearts were once again mechanically beating. The children were secured to rigid pediatric backboards, manually bagged with high-flow pure oxygen, and rushed up the narrow wooden stairs, bursting out into the blinding, indifferent light of the autumn afternoon. As the paramedics sprinted across the overgrown gravel yard toward the waiting flight crews, Lisa watched from the perimeter. She did not fight to ride in the back of the rig. She did not collapse in hysterics. She stood firmly on the driveway, surrounded by the flashing lights of state trooper cruisers, as the helicopters lifted off, carrying Connor and Brinley toward the pediatric intensive care unit at Lehigh Valley Hospital. The massive rotors chopped through the warm air, leaving behind an empty, silent house, a severed wire dog sled, and a mother who had already begun carefully rehearsing her alibi. The pediatric intensive care unit at Lehigh Valley Hospital offered no sanctuary. It was a sterile, hyper-illuminated environment dominated entirely by the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of life support. The monitors above the beds tracked a grim, inescapable reality. Extensive neurological examinations quickly confirmed the absolute destruction of cerebral tissue. The period of oxygen starvation down in the basement had been far too severe, the delay in emergency intervention far too long. For 3 agonizing days, the siblings lay completely motionless, tethered to heavy ventilators, while the final, automatic functions of their bodies slowly began to shut down. In the adjacent waiting areas, the mother's behavior shattered every known psychological protocol of grief. She was not a broken woman clinging to the faint hope of a medical miracle. She was the hyper-vigilant architect of a rapidly crumbling alibi. She paced the polished hospital corridors, not desperately seeking updates from pediatric surgeons, but aggressively peddling a staggering, complex fiction to the detectives and social workers hovering nearby. She claimed the entire atrocity was a calculated murder-suicide orchestrated exclusively by her 8-year-old son. Her defense relied on a foundation of extreme, undocumented psychological torment. She insisted the boy had been the target of merciless daily bullying at his elementary school, that he was so fundamentally broken, so terrified of the harassment, that he had quietly decided to end his own life. The darkest, most unbelievable layer of her narrative was the inclusion of the 4-year-old. She told authorities the boy was simply too frightened to cross over into death alone, so he manipulated his toddler sister into joining him in the basement. The physiological and logistical impossibilities of this claim were glaring. A child of 8 does not possess the cognitive capacity to conceptualize, let alone negotiate, a suicide pact with a toddler. Furthermore, the physical mechanics of the crime scene entirely precluded his involvement. To believe her narrative meant accepting that a boy who could not operate the zipper on his own jacket had somehow secured an industrial-strength, plastic-coated wire tightly over a wooden beam 7 feet in the air. It meant believing he possessed the sheer, explosive physical force required to lift a struggling 40-pound girl, place her neck precisely within a rigid metal loop, and somehow maintain the exact tension necessary to asphyxiate both of them simultaneously. As the hours bled away in the ICU, she continued to construct her shield. She weaponized social media directly from the hospital lobby, leaning heavily into the digital persona she had cultivated for years. She painted herself as the ultimate tragic victim of a negligent school district, attempting to deflect the looming homicide investigation onto an invisible cabal of playground bullies. 50 miles away in Albany Township, the initial shockwave of the tragedy triggered an immediate, compassionate response. Rural communities instinctively close ranks during a sudden crisis. Vigils were organized in the crisp autumn air. Crowdfunding accounts were rapidly established by well-meaning locals to absorb the inevitable, crushing shock of medical and funeral costs. The collective heartache was palpable, driven by the incomprehensible image of 2 young siblings, driven to such a dark, violent end. But as the mother's aggressive media campaign intensified, the local atmosphere completely curdled. Genuine sorrow rapidly mutated into deep, paranoid suspicion. The residents of the small town knew the family. The other parents knew the boy. They watched him on the morning bus. They saw him in the cafeteria. The community knew the reality. He was a gentle kid who loved video games, completely devoid of the dark, violent ideations his mother was now broadcasting to the world. School administrators and teachers quietly, but firmly, dismantled her claims in the background. They provided investigators with a pristine behavioral record. There were absolutely no reports of bullying. There were zero disciplinary actions or signs of depression. The boy was well-liked and fiercely protected by his peers. The local rumor mill accelerated, buzzing through diners and hardware stores across Berks County. The red flags were impossible to ignore. Neighbors openly questioned the sudden appearance of the heavy-duty dog lead, a piece of thick, restrictive equipment entirely unsuited for the small, mixed-breed dog that actually lived on the property. And the most chilling detail, leaked from the initial emergency dispatch, began to circulate like poison. She had stood in the basement, fully capable of lifting them, and had flatly refused to intervene. On September 26, 2019, the ventilators were quietly shut down. The children were pronounced dead within minutes of each other. The immediate medical crisis concluded, but the criminal gears were now turning at full speed. State police investigators did not immediately place the mother in handcuffs. It was a calculated, tactical delay. They allowed her to return to her cluttered home, to keep talking, to keep posting, and to keep digging a hole she could never escape. Every fabricated detail she offered to the public was another nail in the coffin of her defense, giving detectives exactly the quiet time they needed to secure the digital forensics that would utterly destroy her. The investigative machinery of the Pennsylvania State Police operates on a strict doctrine of elimination. Before detectives could officially target the mother, they had to exhaustively dismantle her alibi. They had to hunt for a phantom. The initial phase of the inquiry was forced down a mandated red herring, a deep dive into the elementary school ecosystem to verify the claims of extreme fatal bullying. Investigators descended on the local school district, pulling years of administrative files, disciplinary records, and counseling logs. They interviewed playground monitors, cafeteria staff, and the transportation department. They scrutinized seating charts and cross-referenced behavioral reports. The result was a sprawling, documented void. There was absolutely zero evidence of harassment. Not a single teacher had witnessed an altercation. Not a single aide had reported a conflict. The boy had never filed a complaint, nor had any of his peers reported him being targeted. The analytical focus quickly revealed that the only human being in the entire state of Pennsylvania who had ever mentioned this severe bullying was the mother herself. Detectives mapped the timeline of her complaints and discovered a chilling pattern. She had not been reporting past incidents. She had been actively seeding a preemptive defense. She was laying down a paper trail of institutional concern weeks before she ever intended to use it, constructing a fictional motive for a murder she was quietly planning to execute. With the suicide pact theory completely debunked by the school district's records, the investigative lens snapped back to the cluttered house on Route 143. Crime scene technicians and forensic engineers occupied the basement, tasked with mathematically proving the physical impossibility of the staging. They measured the exact vertical drop from the splintered support beam to the concrete floor. They calculated the combined weight of the heavy wooden dining chairs and the required torque to tip them over. They analyzed the stiff, unyielding nature of the plastic-coated wire. The physics simply did not align with human anatomy. The forensic reconstruction definitively proved that the elaborate double noose mechanism required the height, leverage, and fine manual dexterity of a fully grown adult. The staging was a clumsy theatrical production, designed by someone who vastly overestimated the believability of their own lie. The physical weapon itself provided the next critical fracture in her facade. Detectives seized the black wire dog lead and traced its origins. It was not a forgotten piece of hardware resting in a dusty garage corner. It was a brand new acquisition. Financial records led investigators to a local pet supply store, where transaction logs confirmed the purchase was made just 24 hours before the emergency dispatch. The specifications of the cable were damning. The packaging indicated it was a heavy-duty model, engineered with industrial steel and rated to hold an animal weighing up to 250 pounds. The family did own a dog, a husky mix, but the animal weighed barely 50 pounds and spent its time roaming freely indoors or on a lightweight fabric leash. The heavy, rigid wire was vastly disproportionate to any legitimate pet care need. It was bought for a highly specific, sinister utility. While the physical evidence was cementing the parameters of a double homicide, the digital forensics unit was preparing to deliver the terminal blow. Armed with search warrants, cybercrime specialists extracted the encrypted data from her seized smartphone. The server logs and cached history did not reveal a grieving mother blindsided by a sudden tragedy. The device was a clear, chronological roadmap of premeditated slaughter. Her internet search history exposed a shifting methodology of murder. In the weeks leading up to the autumn afternoon, her queries were highly specific and clinically detached. She had aggressively searched for information on how long it takes to die from carbon monoxide poisoning inside a sealed vehicle. She was actively shopping for the most efficient, untraceable mechanism to eliminate her dependents. When the vehicular exhaust method apparently proved too logistically complex, her digital footprint shifted toward asphyxiation. The cyber timeline grew increasingly darker as the fatal date approached. The extraction software recovered her streaming history, highlighting a bizarre and arrogant psychological profile. In the days directly preceding the basement staging, she had spent hours binge-watching true crime documentary programming. Her viewing logs showed repeated engagement with a television series focused entirely on fugitives and botched investigations, specifically episodes detailing how criminals attempted to evade forensic detection. She was not consuming media for entertainment. She was studying police procedure, hunting for investigative blind spots she could exploit to sell her fabricated murder-suicide narrative. The final absolute destruction of her maternal persona was found hidden within her social messaging applications. Detectives pulled the chat transcripts from the exact window of time she claimed her children were experiencing a profound, fatal psychological crisis. The contrast was staggering. While the complex wire mechanism was being constructed below the floorboards, she was actively engaged in a casual, highly explicit digital exchange. Just hours before dialing emergency services, she was messaging a man, complaining about the general annoyances of her daily routine, and transmitting sexually explicit photographs of herself. Her tone was completely unbothered, a chilling exhibition of normalcy, while an unimaginable atrocity was actively unfolding in the damp shadows of her own home. The district attorney's office reviewed the cascading avalanche of proof. They possessed the forensic reconstruction that defied the laws of physics. They had the retail receipts for the murder weapon. They held the digital logs proving premeditation, research, and a profound lack of emotional distress. The tactical delay had served its purpose. Law enforcement had allowed her to talk, post, and lie for 2 months, giving her enough rope to completely hang her own defense. In late November, the waiting period officially ended. State troopers arrived at her current location, bypassing the polite inquiries of the previous weeks. She was placed in rigid steel handcuffs, formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, and stripped of the victim narrative she had spent years so carefully curating. The judicial reckoning was a protracted, multi-year process. It wasn't until September 2024 that the Berks County Courthouse finally addressed the charges. Opting for a bench trial, the defense bypassed a jury entirely, leaving the final judgment solely to Judge Teresa Johnson. The prosecution's presentation was surgical. They laid out the mechanical impossibility of the basement staging, the retail receipts for the heavy-duty wire lead, and the damning timeline of her internet searches. But the most devastating blow came from within the bloodline. The surviving son, now a young adult, took the stand. He methodically described the reality of the home environment, the timeline of that autumn afternoon, and the absolute lack of bullying surrounding his younger brother. His testimony permanently eradicated the final, desperate fragments of the fabricated suicide pact. Judge Johnson required very little time to deliberate. She returned a swift, unequivocal verdict of guilty on all charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder. A month later, in October 2024, the sentencing phase delivered a terminal conclusion. The court mandated 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. There would be no leniency, no mitigating circumstances acknowledged. The architect of the tragedy was permanently exiled to the state penitentiary system, locked in a concrete cell where she could no longer project a false reality. The iron doors of the penitentiary have closed, but true justice in this case remains a fractured illusion. A sentence of life without parole cannot restore the stolen futures suffocated in that damp, unfinished basement. The defining terror here is not the mechanical staging of the crime itself. It is the absolute perversion of the maternal instinct. Connor and Brinley deserved a quiet life defined by safety and compassion, not a calculated execution administered by the one person nature assigned to protect them. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.